The mole pushed through the hole in the cave wall and settled on the cradle of its tracked carrier. Exiting the gyroscopic troop section, Lennox marched down a set of stairs slid out by a pair of hunchbacked servitors. The cave was crowded with other tunneling machines that were the workhorses of the Omnissian Faithful's holy work: hellbores, termites, and smaller breaching drills. "Process the retrievals," the Princeps ordered as she departed the Archimedex, leaving Zarko and Omnex 70 in charge. "I'm going to see the Lexicist." Lennox made her way through Invalis base. Situated as they were, deep beneath the highlands, the Omnissian Faithful had so far managed to avoid the attention of the Dark Mechanicum. Orbital surveillance stations and marauder vigilance crisscrossed the hemisphere with their augers and pict feeds. Ordo Reductor extermination squads searched for rebel elements forge by forge. Demon engines stalked the dunes of Mars, following the sweet scent of unwarped flesh. None had found Invalis base. Using burrowing transports like the Archimedex, the rebels of the Omnissian Faithful broke surface leagues away, ensuring that no track, no footprints or heat signatures left a trail back home. The region had always been a dead zone, avoided by the Mechanicum and Knightly Orders alike. Crystal deposits in the mountains gave off a strange radiation that resisted auger scans, turned data streams to static, and drained cells of power. The highlands were scattered with the rusted wrecks of constructs, vehicles, and aircraft that had accidentally wandered in, while the canyons swarmed with feral servitors, whose populations in such an area had gone unchecked. With the base situated in a small network of caves far below the mountains, the Omnissian Faithful managed to operate beyond the debilitating technological phenomenon, while at the same time benefiting from its natural protection. Lennox moved through numerous gauntlets and checkpoints, manned by heavily armed gun servitors and monstrously bastardized servo-automata. The base itself was a ramshackle place of draping power cables, scavenged equipment, and facilities creatively crafted from scrap. Genitors worked on vat-bred reinforcements in their improvised labs. Lennox passed liberated tech thralls who stood at their posts in the rags of their old uniforms. Cybernetically adapted laborers and menials moved crates of ammunition, blessed unguent, and supplies to the lower caves. Scavengers delivered weapons and recovered parts to the artisans in the workshops. Repulsor drones drifted about their duties, while engine seers made constant repairs and rough refurbishments to the base. Code scrubbers monitored the local lines, code streams, and new spherics for any hint of corruption. Consoles and rune banks, meanwhile, were manned by exhausted adepts and half-mangled servitors. As Lennox marched down the grill walkways, she acknowledged the leaders of other rebel groups heading out on missions to the surface. Former Skitarii sub-alphas, secular priests, and ad secularis thrall masters, all leading squads of mismatched troops and constructs. The command center was a crowded nexus of battered runebanks, cabling, and interfaced servitors. The crackle of hololithic displays lit up the gloom, while the air was thick with new spheric chatter and scrubbed vox streams. Entering the command center, Lennox found Archid Cornelicus, the Magos Catharch in charge of base security. The priest moved between a nexus of rune screens, with a nest of data lines and cables reaching down from the ceiling and plugged into the many ports and interfaces that covered his body. Watching over his work was the hag Logista, Algerna Zephyrion, a tall but crooked construct in ragged red robes. The depths of the ancient's hood were lit by optics of ever-changing color and sequence, while her emaciated form clicked continually with calculus engines like a fine clockwork instrument. She waited upon the third construct observing the rune screens in the command center. Trundling forth on a tracked throne was Raman Sink, Lexorcist Ward Engine and leader of the Omnissian Faithful. Sink had been a Covenant agent of the Mechanicum, responsible for the prosecution of techno-heresy for the Prefecture Magisterium, the Malagra, and the Lexorcist General of Mars. He had been better prepared than most when the infectious corruption of the scrap code swept across the Red Planet, and the maddened Fabricator General had declared war on all true subjects of the Omnissiah. But Sync had paid a terrible price in those early days of war and betrayal. Now he was but a broken construct. He had found purpose, however, in the doom of Mars. In the dark days since, he had established the Omnissian faithful and launched a campaign of sabotage and destruction upon the Dark Mechanicum from deep beneath Invalis. Although he was little more than a red-robed cadaver restricted to a throne, the metal digits of Sync's skeletal hands were at constant work upon the rune keys of a clavier board built into his chest. A floating servo-skull called Confabulari 66, with an undercarriage of tools, interface lines, and clawed appendages, fussed about him, attending to the Lexorcist's needs. Sync's voice even proceeded from loud hailers mounted on the servo-skull. "My lord," Lennox said, stepping through the cables of the command center and kneeling briefly. Confabulari 66 circled the Princeps slowly. "Princeps," the Lexorcist said through the servo-skull's loud hailers. "Your mission to Temple Tarantine was a success. A mighty god machine denied to Kelbor Hall and his accursed war master." "Yes, Lexorcist." "Yet the same scavengers reported that some hours later," Ramon Sync said, "the Belladon Ventorum, the engine that hunted you at Tarantine, left the assembly yards in company with 2 other warlord titans. They marched across the Argai Planitia, the Autonox solar collector fields, and on into the Invalis region. A corrupted siege company of Cryos battle tanks and a section of Thalaxi joined them at Malia Corda." "Godacor?" "Undoubtedly," the Lexorcist agreed. "Then we need to mobilize," Lennox said. "Why haven't you sounded the general alarm?" "Because they stopped at Phasmi Fosse." "Outside the dead zone?" "I don't think the Magos Reductor can know of our location," Ramon Sync told her. "If he knew where we are, he wouldn't have sent Titans and siege equipment. He expects to find a rebel fort or camp. His god machines won't help him here, and not in the Invalis dead zone either." A rasping chuckle emanated from the loud hailers. "But how could the Ordo Reductor even know we're in the area?" Lennox said. "Timings and trajectories don't lie," Logista Zephyrion said. "The Titans followed you from Temple Tarantine to Autonox to here." "That's impossible," Lennox told the hag defiantly. "We were well below auger range. We surfaced only once to pick up scavengers and salvage." "The Magos Catharch has a theory," Sync said. "A theory I am putting to the test," Archid Cornelicus said, moving between rune screens, trailing cerebral cabling. As the main screen sizzled into focus, Lennox saw that it was showing visual feed captures from the base's quarantine facility, a large reinforced cell that was used by the Magos Catharch and his code scrubbers to inspect constructs and materiel for evidence of corruption. In the reinforced quarantine chamber, the Princeps could see the towering Castellan pattern robot standing upright but lifeless. Dwarfed by the battle automaton and hugging the rocky wall was Lenk 4 of 12, diagnostic cabling swinging from his ports and up into the ceiling hub. Cornelicus activated the Vox receivers. "Get me out of here!" Lenk 4 of 12 howled. "Don't leave me in here with this thing!" The forge laborer seemed genuinely uncomfortable in the robot's solemn presence. "You think the battle automaton is corrupted?" Lennox asked. "That it somehow transmitted a trace of our position?" "We'll soon know," Archid Cornelicus said. The Princeps looked down at the floor, and then at the Lexorcist. The Magos Catharch spoke into his Vox bead. "Release the probes." Lennox watched the rune screen as mech spiders dropped down from the quarantine chamber ceiling on thin cables. They crawled about the armored shell of the battle automata, fawning over it with their auger probosces. Several flattened themselves and, trailing their lines, scrabbled between the armored plates of the robot, to inspect its inner workings. Both the scavengers who found it and my engineer examined the unit, but could find no evidence of pollution. Yes, Logista Zephyrion said, her voice a harsh reproach. A find altogether too good to be true. The good princeps is not to be blamed for this, Ramon Sink said, silencing the hag. Diamond Gordakor becomes more desperate and devious by the day. He's a warped construct answering to equally warped masters. He's ready to try anything. He knows that rebel groups need a constant supply of weapons and equipment. He simply needs to scatter such tracked items about and wait for our scavengers to bring them back to base. Inevitable, really. Princeps Lennox is right, the Magos Catharch said, processing the data returning from the mech spider swarm. Neither I nor my code scrubbers are finding indications of corruption. The machine appears clean. All the more reason for our scavengers to take it in the field, Algerna Zephyrion insisted. This is bait. What of tracking devices? Ramon Sink asked. We need to know if this battle automaton harbors a device that led the Ordo Reductor here, at least up to the edge of the dead zone. Well, I can tell you that it has no cortex or processor, Cornelicus said, and that its reactor core is burnt out, although I have some kind of energy signature. There, Lennox said, squinting at the visual feed. In its chest, an augmentation that my engineer couldn't identify. The polyhedral cogs of the orb were in motion, each gear synchronizing impossibly with hundreds of others. It was mesmerizing to watch. What is the name of this cursed machine? Ramon Sink demanded to know. Identica recorded as Impedicus, Archid Cornelicus said. First maniple, Daedari Reserve. By the Omnissiah. No, Ramon Sink gasped, his projected voice wavering. The Tabula Myriad! You've seen this thing before? Lennox said. What is it? A long time ago, the Lexorcist said. It is a heretical thing of monstrous power, an exigency engine, an abominable intelligence that I thought I had buried deep in a dungeon diagnostica. What does it do? The Princeps asked. The Tabula Myriad wins, using the coldest logic and computational power beyond the servants of the machine god. With that, the battle automata suddenly crackled with power. The mech spiders beneath its armored shell were fried within the machine's workings, and their trailing lines fused to Impedicus's feeds. The lamps and the rune screens of the command center momentarily faded, before cycling through screeds of information at impossible speeds. What's happening? Lennox said. It's in, Archid Cornelicus said, his voice tinged with fear. It's using the probe lines to draw power from the base reactor. Shut it down, the Princeps shouted. I can't! The Magos Catharch tugged at the crown of cables ported into his skull. It's reversed the data stream on the same lines. Instead of inspecting it, the machine is now raiding our rune banks. I have no base control. As the Magos panicked and tried to rip his cables free, Lennox stepped forward. Drawing her chain blade, she gunned the weapon's motor and cut through the cables, freeing the Magos Catharch from the influence of the abominable intelligence. She looked back to the rune screens. Impedicus had stomped forward, trailing cable lines behind it. The Tabula Myriad's polyhedral cogs spinning in a blur of alien synchronicity. Lank 4 of 12 was screaming. The menial, who had been fearful of the battle automata when it was a lifeless shell, was now throwing himself wildly at the thick armor glass of the quarantine observation window, his data cables swinging wildly. Battering himself bloody and insensible, he shrieked like a madman. Tearing at his body and face, he turned to face Impedicus. The battle automata drowned the forge laborer in its shadow. The screaming stopped. Lank 4 of 12's face seemed to relax. Then, horribly, he thrust his fingers into his stomach with such mindless force that he tore a gaping hole in his own abdomen. Fishing around in his guts, with dark-eyed lunacy plastered across his features, the menial tore a black metallic device from his body. It was covered in spines and flickered with an infernal light.
"Is this what you are looking for?"
Lank 4 of 12 hissed in a voice that was not his own. The menial's skin smoldered to darkness. His teeth grew, and his facial features warped into a visage of demonic savagery. The data cables connecting him to the hub began to seethe with malevolent code. The battle automata Impedicus stood silently over the possessed Forge Worlder. Logista Zephyrion staggered back. Both Ramon Sink and Confabulari 66 simply stared at the horror unfolding in the quarantine chamber. Lennox hit a Vox stud on the rune bank. "Activate incendiary countermeasures," she ordered, but the code scrubbers and the gun servitors outside the chamber couldn't hear. The tabula Myriad was blocking the transmission. She turned to leave the command center. "I've got to get down there and destroy them."
"Wait,"
Ramon Sink said. He was staring at the rune screen so intently that it drew Lennox back to the spectacle. The demon fury of Lank 4 of 12 faltered. Rather than the Castellan, it had been the menial recruit who had been carrying the tracking device, the device that could have led Gordicor's Ordo Reductor Force to Invalis. But now, the fused diagnostic lines bucked and flickered as Impedicus sent a cold stream of logic back into the ceiling hub. Lank 4 of 12 let out a pained screech so loud that it distorted the audio channels. In the presence of the abominable intelligence, bathed in cold logic and the truths undeniable, the false construct was cleansed of its corruption. Lennox watched the impossible on the rune screen. The demonic presence was banished from Lank 4 of 12. The infernal light died in his eyes. Like tumorous growths before the intensity of radiation, the menial's corrupted flesh withered. Allowing the tracking device to drop to the floor, Lank 4 of 12 lost consciousness and followed it, the limp data cables tugging loose from his interface ports as he fell. Lifting an armored foot, Impedicus stamped down on the tracking device, crushing the filth of its inner workings into the floor. "We found Dark Mechanicum Skitari and shock troops in the field," Lennox said, turning to the Lexorcist. "They had been purged of corruption." Sink nodded slowly.
"Disengage the quarantine failsafes."
"What are you doing?" Archid Cornelicus demanded. "This thing must be destroyed."
"The enemy of my enemy,"
the Lexorcist said. Confabulari 66 looked at Algerna Zephyrion.
"We are not a threat that concerns the tabula Myriad."
"Correct," the crone said, processing her terrible equations.
"It wants what it has always wanted, dominion over Mars. As far as the abominable intelligence is concerned, we are no threat to its ambitions. The Dark Mechanicum, however, is, and it must be neutralized, in fire or in spirit."
"The greater the number of pure constructs fighting the corrupted," the Logista added, "the greater its chances of success."
"Lexorcist," Lennox said, "what do we do?"
"Nothing," Ramon Sink said. "Open all data lines."
"That's insanity," Archid Cornelicus said, checking over the rune banks. "The abominable intelligence is infiltrating all of our systems and new spherics with its signal. It already has transmission across to the base's border beacons. Instead of alerting us to the presence of intruders, the beacons could advertise our presence to the whole of the quadrant."
"Let me hear it,"
the Lexorcist ordered. Flicking a stud, the Magos Catharch reluctantly allowed Impedicus's searing signal to fill the command center. It was simultaneously the most beautiful and horrific thing Lennox had ever heard. Code, cold and constantly recalculating. An irresistible arithmetical force. A song for the red sands of Mars. Cornelicus's nest of rune banks sizzled suddenly to static, then fell blank. Letter by letter, word by word, a message began to appear across them, like a forgeling learning code for the first time, or a construct struggling to communicate in a different cant. Exigent assessment, adapt, enhance, replicate. Extermination of threat presentation, adapt, enhance, replicate. Planetary assimilation, adapt, enhance, replicate. Solar system assimilation, adapt, enhance, replicate. Galactic assimilation, adapt, enhance, replicate. Universal assimilation, adapt, enhance, replicate. 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 Adapt, enhance, replicate.
We have prayed, and the Omnissiah has delivered,
Ramon Sink said finally.
A dire weapon for a dire threat. Fire with which to fight fire.
It is heretical,
Archid Cornelicus pleaded with the Lexorcist.
Then let us all be damned, but Mars be saved. This is a heretical weapon for heretical times. Princeps!
Yes, Lexorcist.
I need eyes out on the sands,
Ramon Sink said.
Go and see what horror the tabula Myriad visits upon the enemies at our borders.
Looking between Cornelicus, the Lexorcist, and the line-draped figures of Impedicus standing in the quarantine chamber, Lennox turned and left the command center.